The grand cathedral was packed with worshippers, their hands raised in reverence. At the pulpit stood Prophet Nathaniel Papa Obade, a man in his late 40s, dressed in an elegant black and gold robe embroidered with celestial symbols. His deep-set eyes glowed with a mysterious charisma, his smile a blend of warmth and something unplaceable. His congregation adored him. He was their guiding light, their miracle worker, the man who made the crippled walk and the barren conceive. His sermons were mesmerizing, his voice deep and commanding, laced with an eerie authority that kept his audience in a trance. "God has chosen me to deliver you from the chains of suffering," he declared, lifting his ornate staff high. The room trembled as his followers wept in faith. But hidden behind the grandeur of his words was a man burdened with secrets darker than the night. When the lights of the church dimmed and the crowds dispersed, the true face of Prophet Nathaniel emerged. When the last worshipper left the church, Prophet Nathaniel retreated to his private chambers. Unlike the grand altar bathed in light, his hidden sanctuary was a stark contrast, draped in dark velvet curtains with candle-lit sigils covering the floor. In the dim glow, the air felt thick, heavy, with a presence unseen. The grand man of God unfastened his robe, revealing underneath a necklace of bone-like charms, each inscribed with a different symbol. He sighed, rubbing his temples as if exhausted by the very act of preaching. The silence was broken by the soft sound of rustling fabric. A figure emerged from the shadows. A woman, Sister Evelyn, his most devoted follower. She knelt before him, eyes filled with reverence and fear. "The offering is ready, Papa," she whispered. Nathaniel smirked, stepping toward the altar at the far end of the room. A large black bowl sat atop it, filled with dark crimson liquid that pulsed faintly under the candlelight. He dipped his fingers into it, murmuring in an ancient tongue. The price of miracles was always paid in blood. The night was thick with silence, the only sound being the crackling of torches in the underground chamber beneath the church. A young man, no older than 20, knelt before Prophet Nathaniel, his hands tied behind his back. His face was streaked with dried tears, his lips trembling as he whispered prayers under his breath. "Papa, please," he sobbed. But Nathaniel only smiled, placing a firm hand on the boy's head. "The Lord requires obedience," he murmured before raising his gleaming dagger. The boy's screams never left the room. As Nathaniel plunged the blade deep into his chest, the crimson liquid spilled over the altar, pooling around the sigils drawn onto the stone floor. The room seemed to vibrate, as if the very ground acknowledged the sacrifice. Nathaniel inhaled deeply, his eyes fluttering shut in twisted ecstasy. Power surged through his veins. This was the price of his miracles, the blood that kept his followers blind to his true nature. In the next Sunday sermon, the cathedral was packed to capacity. Devotees pressed against each other, sweating under the golden glow of candlelight, their eyes fixed on the elevated pulpit. Tonight was a miracle night, a night where Papa, the great prophet Nathaniel, would perform wonders. Nathaniel spread his arms wide, his voice booming across the hall. "Tonight the Lord shall move among us." The crowd erupted in cheers. But beyond the pulpit, hidden in the shadows, his men were already in position. The miracles were prepared. He turned to the crowd, eyes locking onto a frail-looking woman in a wheelchair at the front. "You, my daughter," he called, stepping down toward her. "The Lord has told me of your suffering," the woman sobbed, trembling in her chair. The choir began humming softly. Nathaniel placed his hands over the woman's head. "Do you believe in the power of God?" She nodded frantically. "Then rise." The silence was thick with tension. The woman's hands shook as she placed them on the arms of her chair and stood. The church exploded in hysteria. People screamed, crying, falling to their knees. The woman, tears streaming down her face, took a shaky step, then another. "Praise God!" Nathaniel shouted, lifting his hands skyward. What the crowd didn't know was that the woman had been hired. Days before, she had walked into the cathedral on her own 2 feet. Nathaniel's men had found her, offered her money, promised her blessings, and now she was playing her part perfectly. Nathaniel turned sharply. "There is another here tonight, a man who has been blind for 20 years. Another gasp rippled through the room as a middle-aged man stumbled forward, led by 2 ushers. His eyes were clouded, his hands stretched out in front of him. "Papa!" the blind man sobbed, falling to his knees. "I have been blind since I was a child." Nathaniel knelt, cupping the man's face. "Do you have faith, my son?" The man nodded vigorously. "Then see." Nathaniel blew softly onto the man's forehead, muttering a foreign incantation. The choir swelled, and suddenly the man gasped. His hands shot to his eyes. He trembled. And then, in a voice that shook the room, he screamed. I can see. The cathedral erupted into chaos. People leapt from their seats, hands raised, voices crying out in worship. The ushers grabbed the blind man, holding him up as he twirled in place, seeing for the first time in 20 years. Nathaniel raised his hands, letting the hysteria settle. "Let it be known," he declared, "that faith is the key to miracles." His voice echoed through the cathedral, drowning in the deafening sound of believers clapping and shouting. The blind man had never been blind. He had met Nathaniel's men days before and rehearsed his miraculous sight. He had been paid handsomely, enough to keep silent forever. Nathaniel turned back toward the pulpit, lifting his hands to bless the room. But he knew the real miracle wasn't healing. It was control. And tonight, he had just gained hundreds more followers. The next morning, Prophet Nathaniel stood before his congregation, radiating divine energy. His voice thundered across the cathedral, speaking of blessings, miracles, and breakthroughs. The people cheered, completely unaware of the dark forces that fueled their leader's powers. As he lifted his hands in prayer, a woman in the front row, Madame Ruth, gasped, her eyes widening in fear. She could see something no one else could. Shadowy figures writhing behind Nathaniel, their grotesque forms flickering like dying embers. Madame Ruth clutched her chest, her breathing ragged. She tried to dismiss it as a trick of the mind, but the more she stared, the clearer the figures became. They whispered in voices only she could hear, hissing words in a language unknown. Nathaniel's eyes flicked toward her, just for a moment, and in that split second she felt her soul turn cold. He knew she could see them, and worse, she knew he would not let her leave alive. Madame Ruth stumbled out of the cathedral, her breath coming in short, frantic gasps. She knew she had to warn someone, anyone, before it was too late. But the moment she stepped onto the cobblestone streets, the air shifted, as if something unseen had tightened its grip around her. The church bells rang, but their sound felt distant, distorted. A dark presence trailed behind her, unseen but felt. Her heart pounded. She wasn't alone. She turned a corner, reaching the town square where she spotted Deacon Abel, a man she had trusted for years. "You must listen to me," she whispered urgently, clutching his arm. "Papa is not who he claims to be." But as soon as the words left her lips, Abel's face darkened. His warm, familiar eyes turned cold. He glanced over her shoulder, as if confirming something. Then, in a voice too calm, too rehearsed, he said, "Madame Ruth, you should rest. Come with me." Madame Ruth hesitated, sensing the trap too late. Before she could react, Abel's grip on her tightened. "Come, let's pray together," he murmured, his tone dangerously soothing. She jerked away, stumbling back into the shadows of the narrow alley. The moment she did, she saw them. The Watchers. Silhouettes of humanoid figures with glowing eyes stood in the dark, their heads tilting unnaturally as they observed her. They did not move. They only watched. A tremor ran down her spine. The air itself seemed to hum with something unnatural. "What are you?" she whispered. The Watchers did not answer, but one took a slow, deliberate step forward. Their mouths did not move, yet she heard them, a whispering chorus of voices in her mind. "Go back. Forget what you saw." Her body refused to move, trapped between terror and the unseen force that had woven itself into the very fabric of the church's influence. Deep within the grand cathedral, Prophet Nathaniel stood in his candle-lit chamber, eyes closed, listening. He felt Madame Ruth's terror as if it were a ripple in a still pond. The watchers had found her. He smiled. She knew too much. Turning toward a tall ornate mirror, he whispered a low incantation. The mirror's surface trembled before revealing Ruth's reflection, standing frozen in the alley. She would soon be silenced. The door creaked open behind him. Sister Evelyn entered, her face pale. "Papa," she murmured, "should we—" "Handle this quietly." Nathaniel turned, his expression unreadable. "No need," he said, running a hand over the mirror. "The watchers are already with her. She will not trouble us any longer." Evelyn swallowed hard, nodding. Yet deep in her heart she wondered, how many more secrets did she not know about the man she had devoted her life to? Madame Ruth's legs felt like lead, but she forced herself to move. She stumbled down the alley, gasping for air, as the watchers loomed behind her, their eyes burning like cold fire. The whispers in her head grew louder. "Forget, forget, forget!" But she wouldn't. She couldn't. She had to warn someone. Summoning every last ounce of strength, she ran. She burst into the street, crashing into a startled young man. Elijah, a local journalist. "Please, help me," she gasped, clutching his coat. Elijah steadied her, confusion in his eyes. "Madame Ruth? What's wrong?" She looked back. The alley was empty. The watchers had vanished, but she knew they were still watching, just beyond human sight. Trembling, she whispered, "The prophet, he's not who you think he is." Elijah studied Madame Ruth, concern flickering in his eyes. She was well known in town, a respected elder, not prone to wild stories. "Madame Ruth, are you sure?" he asked gently. "Papa has done so much for this community." Ruth gripped his arm tighter. "You must listen to me, child. I have seen things." Her voice trembled. "Dark things, his miracles. They come at a cost." Elijah glanced around, suddenly feeling watched. The air was too still, too heavy. "All right," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me everything." Madame Ruth exhaled, relief momentarily crossing her face. "Not here," she muttered, pulling him toward a side street. "They're always listening." Elijah followed, his journalist instincts flaring. If what she said was true, this could be the biggest story of his career, or the last one he ever told. Back at the grand cathedral, Prophet Nathaniel sat in his private chamber, the flames from the candles flickering unnaturally. He stirred a goblet of thick red liquid, watching the ripples dance. He did not need to see Madame Ruth to know what she was doing. He could feel it. A disruption. A betrayal. His lips curled into a smirk. The door creaked open and Deacon Abel entered, bowing slightly. "Papa?" he murmured. "There's been an incident." Nathaniel raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Abel hesitated before continuing. "Madame Ruth, she's speaking to someone." A slow smile spread across the prophet's face. He placed the goblet down and rose to his feet. "Then let's remind her why some truths should never be spoken." Madame Ruth led Elijah into her small home, locking the door behind her. She pulled the curtains shut, hands trembling. "They don't like the light," she whispered. Elijah watched her, his skepticism faltering. "Madame Ruth," he said gently, "what exactly did you see?" Ruth inhaled sharply, then began her story. She told him about the watchers, about the secret rituals, about the things no one dared to speak of. She told him about the women, the ones who disappeared after visiting the prophet's chambers, the ones who reappeared, hollow-eyed, whispering of visions and commands they did not understand. Elijah scribbled furiously, each word sending chills down his spine. "And you saw all this?" he asked. Madame Ruth nodded, and worse. As Elijah absorbed Madame Ruth's words, something shifted. The air grew colder. The old woman stiffened, her face turning pale. "They're here," she whispered. Elijah frowned. "Who's here?" Ruth's trembling hand pointed toward the window. Slowly, cautiously, Elijah turned his head. The window was black. Not the normal darkness of the night, but a suffocating emptiness. Then, a face appeared. Not human, not fully formed, just a pair of burning eyes, watching, waiting. Elijah's breath hitched. "Don't move," Ruth murmured. "They only act if they know you see them." Elijah's heart pounded. The burning eyes in the window did not blink, did not move. The room felt colder, heavier, as if the air itself was suffocating him. "Don't acknowledge it," Madame Ruth whispered, her voice barely audible. "If they know you see them, they will act." Elijah swallowed hard, forcing himself to look away, but he could feel the presence lingering, waiting. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then, without warning, a soft tap echoed against the glass. Tap, tap, tap. Elijah flinched. The tap was not from a hand. It was sharper, more deliberate, like the clicking of bone against glass. He clenched his fists. "Madame Ruth," he whispered urgently. "What happens if they know I see them?" Ruth's face was grim. "Then they take you." Miles away, inside the grand cathedral, Prophet Nathaniel knelt before his altar, whispering in a language older than time. His lips curled into a knowing smile. "It has begun," he murmured, his voice filled with dark satisfaction. A figure stood behind him, Sister Evelyn, her face pale. "Papa," she whispered. "Who are they watching?" Nathaniel rose to his feet, his golden robes flowing like liquid shadow, an old woman who should have died long ago. Sister Evelyn's hands trembled. She had always followed the prophet blindly, but something about tonight unsettled her. "And the boy?" she asked cautiously. Nathaniel smirked. "A journalist, curious, brave, but all men fall when faced with what they cannot understand." He turned to face her, his gaze piercing. "Do you doubt me, Sister Evelyn?" The young woman stiffened, shaking her head. "No, Papa." But in her heart she was no longer sure. Back in Madame Ruth's home, the tapping stopped. The room fell into unnatural silence. Elijah exhaled, his hands trembling. "They're gone," he whispered. Ruth shook her head. "They never leave. They just move closer." Elijah forced himself to stand, his legs weak. "We need to go. We can't stay here." Ruth grabbed his wrist. "We can't leave at night." Elijah frowned. "Why?" The old woman swallowed hard. "Because they move at dusk, and they hunt in the dark." Elijah checked his watch. 3:27 a.m. He gritted his teeth. "So we wait?" Madame Ruth nodded. "Until dawn." Elijah paced the room, every shadow feeling too deep, every noise amplified. Outside, the streets were silent. Too silent. It was as if the entire town was holding its breath. Elijah swallowed. "And if they get in?" Ruth met his gaze, her voice hollow. "Then we pray it's quick." The moment the first church bells rang, the heavy presence lifted. Elijah let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. The watchers were gone, for now. Ruth staggered to the window, parting the curtains just slightly. Nothing. The street was normal, as if the night's horror had never happened. But she knew better. They were still watching. Always. Elijah grabbed his bag, stuffing his notes inside. "We go now," Madame Ruth nodded. "But not to the police, not to the church. We go to someone outside of their reach." Elijah frowned. "Who?" Ruth hesitated before answering. "An ex-disciple, someone who walked away from the prophet." Elijah's journalist instincts flared. He had no idea what he was stepping into, but he knew one thing. This was no longer just a story. Elijah drove through the quiet outskirts of town, his grip tight on the steering wheel. Madame Ruth sat beside him, silent, eyes scanning the road. "Where exactly are we going?" he finally asked. "To someone who escaped," Ruth muttered. "One of his former chosen. If anyone knows the truth, it's her." They pulled up to a small, run-down cottage on the edge of the woods. Elijah cut the engine, eyeing the peeling paint, the boarded-up windows. "She's still here?" he asked skeptically. Ruth nodded. "She has nowhere else to go." Taking a deep breath, she knocked on the door. Silence. Then the sound of shuffling inside. The door creaked open, revealing a gaunt woman in her late 30s, her sunken eyes filled with paranoia. The woman's name was Naomi. She let them inside, bolting the door behind them. The house was bare, almost abandoned, save for rows of crosses and protective sigils carved into the walls. Elijah swallowed. "You were one of them." Naomi's lip twitched. "I was his favourite. Until I wasn't." Naomi's hands shook as she poured herself a drink. "Papa chose me to be a vessel for his power. He called me blessed." Her voice cracked. Then the dream started. Voices, shadows, things moving in my room. She looked at them with wild eyes. "You don't understand. His power isn't from God. It's from something else." Elijah leaned forward. "Tell me about the others, the women." Naomi's breath hitched. She looked away. "They went to his chambers, and they never came back the same." Elijah's stomach turned. "Did they disappear?" Naomi shook her head. "No, they returned, but different, empty, obedient, like something had been taken from them. Some of them were pregnant when they went in." Naomi whispered. "None of them were when they came out." Elijah felt his blood run cold. "You're saying he—" Naomi cut him off. "I'm saying we were never meant to have his children. He made sure of it." Madame Ruth inhaled sharply. "There was one," she murmured. Naomi's head snapped toward her. "No," Ruth continued. "One who escaped him while still carrying his child." Naomi's breath came in short gasps. "You don't speak her name," she warned. Elijah's heart pounded. "Who is she?" Naomi hesitated. Then, barely above a whisper, she said, "Miriam." She ran before he could find out. "If she's alive, she has his weakness," Naomi said. Ruth nodded. "And that's why he's been looking for her ever since." Elijah clenched his fists. "Where is she?" Naomi exhaled. "If she's smart, far, far away." But something in her eyes said otherwise. Back at the Grand Cathedral, Prophet Nathaniel sat in the darkness, his fingers tapping against his chair. "They know," he murmured. "They've spoken her name." He turned his gaze toward the shadows in the corner. "Find them," he ordered. The shadows shifted. Something inside them moved. And then they were gone. The hunt had begun. Elijah sat frozen as Naomi's words settled in. "Miriam." The name felt heavy, dangerous. "If she's still alive, we have to find her," he said. Naomi shook her head. "You don't understand. If you say her name, he hears." Miles away, within the Grand Cathedral, Prophet Nathaniel's eyes snapped open. He had been meditating, but now something was wrong. He stood abruptly, his hands trembling slightly. He had spent years silencing whispers of her name, and now someone had spoken it again. His face darkened. "It's time to end this." Elijah wasted no time. "Where do we start?" he asked. Naomi hesitated before pulling out an old notebook. "Miriam used to write letters. She never sent them. I found this after she left." She slid it across the table. The pages were yellowed, the ink smudged. One letter stood out. Elijah read aloud. "I know what he is. I know what he does. If you're reading this, it means I've failed. Don't let him find the child." His stomach dropped. He looked at Naomi. She was pregnant? Naomi nodded. "And if the child survived, he's the key to destroying Nathaniel." At that exact moment, deep inside the cathedral, Prophet Nathaniel smiled. He walked slowly toward his altar, running his fingers over the ancient wood. "Bring me Deacon Abel," he commanded. A hooded figure bowed and disappeared into the darkness. A few minutes later, Deacon Abel entered. "Papa?" His voice was cautious. Nathaniel turned, eyes gleaming with something unreadable. "I need you to send a message." Abel hesitated. "To whom?" The prophet's smile widened. "To those who think they can hide from me." Back at Naomi's cottage, Elijah studied the letters, piecing together fragments of Miriam's past. He circled dates, addresses. Then the front door rattled. Everyone froze. Naomi's breath hitched. They found us. Before anyone could move, fire exploded through the window. Smoke filled the room. We have to go, now. Elijah grabbed the notebook and threw a coat over the flames, but it was spreading too fast. Naomi coughed, covering her mouth. The back door, she choked. They barely made it out before the roof collapsed behind them. The trio ran, the night air cold against their burned skin. Behind them, the house burned brightly against the dark sky. Naomi sobbed, her past literally turning to ash. Elijah held onto the notebook tightly. We need to find Miriam. Now. They pushed deeper into the woods, but something felt wrong. The trees were too still. The silence was unnatural. Ruth suddenly stopped. They're here! Elijah's blood ran cold. Who? Ruth turned slowly, her voice barely audible. The Watchers! Back at the cathedral, Deacon Abel approached Prophet Nathaniel. It is done, he murmured. The prophet nodded slowly. Good. He turned back toward his altar, his fingers tightening on the edge. Now, we wait for them to come to us. Nathaniel exhaled, eyes closed. Miriam, he whispered. Wherever you are, I will find you. And somewhere, far away, a woman jolted awake, as if she had just heard her name whispered from the darkness. Miriam sat up in bed, her breath ragged. The name she had long buried had been spoken. She didn't know how, but she felt it. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the worn-out locket around her neck, the only thing she had left of the past she had escaped. She swung her legs off the bed, her heart pounding. They had found her. She knew it was only a matter of time before Nathaniel sent his followers. She needed to run, again, but this time she wasn't running alone. Miriam placed a hand on the small, sleeping figure beside her. Wake up, darling, we have to go. At the Grand Cathedral, Prophet Nathaniel sat in silence, eyes closed. The room was dark, the air thick with an unnatural presence. Then, his breath hitched. He saw her. Miriam. And the child. His lips curled into a wicked smile. So you have survived. Deacon Abel approached cautiously. Papa? He whispered. Nathaniel slowly opened his eyes, his gaze burning with newfound purpose. She has the child, he murmured. Abel stiffened. Do you want me to... Nathaniel waved a hand dismissively. No, I will go to her myself. Miriam rushed through the dark streets, her son's small hand clutched tightly in hers. Mama, where are we going? He asked groggily. She couldn't tell him, not yet. He was still too young to understand what he was. The boy looked up at her. Is he coming for us? Miriam's chest tightened. She didn't want to lie, she couldn't. Yes, baby, she whispered. But we won't let him take you. The boy nodded, something ancient and knowing flickering behind his young eyes. Elijah drove fast, gripping the wheel. Naomi sat in the back, silent, while Madame Ruth watched the passing landscape. We need to find Miriam before he does, Elijah said, glancing at the notebook. Naomi sighed. That's the problem. She doesn't want to be found. Ruth exhaled. She won't trust us. But if we can reach her first, she'll have no choice. Elijah nodded. Where do we start? Naomi hesitated, then pointed at an address in the notebook. Here. It's the last place she wrote about before she vanished. At sunrise, Prophet Nathaniel stepped out of the cathedral for the first time in months. His followers watched in awe, whispering among themselves. Papa walks among us, one murmured. Nathaniel smiled. He was going to bring Miriam home. He stepped into the waiting car. Deacon Abel sat beside him, adjusting his sleeves nervously. Where to, Papa? The prophet tilted his head, as if listening to something only he could hear. Then, softly, he murmured, To the woman who ran? Miriam and her son reached a small train station, half deserted in the early morning light. She kept her hood up, glancing over her shoulder. "We'll be safe soon," she whispered, but deep down she knew better. A few miles away, Elijah's car sped toward the same station. He had no idea he was running straight toward the storm, and worse, neither did Miriam. Miriam gripped her son's hand as they stepped onto the empty train platform. The morning air was crisp, but the tension in her chest was suffocating. She checked the time. 10 minutes until the train arrived. 10 minutes until they could disappear. Her son tugged at her sleeve. "Mama, someone's coming." Miriam's breath hitched. She turned. Footsteps approached. A man in a long coat, eyes locked on her. For a moment she thought it was him, but then the man called out, "Miriam?" Her heart stopped. "Elijah." Elijah held up his hands. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said quickly, "but you're in danger. He's coming for you." Miriam's fingers curled around her son's shoulder. "He's always coming for me." Elijah stepped closer. "You have the key to stopping him, your son." Miriam inhaled sharply. "He's just a boy." Elijah's gaze darkened. "You know that's not true." Miriam swallowed. "I ran to keep him safe. If you know what Nathaniel wants, then you should run too." Elijah shook his head. "We can end this, but we have to do it now." A black car pulled into the station parking lot. The engine cut. Silence. Then, the back door opened. Prophet Nathaniel stepped out, his golden robes catching the morning light. Deacon Abel followed behind him, scanning the platform. "They're here, Papa." Nathaniel's lips curled into a calm, knowing smile. He took a deep breath, feeling the air hume around him. "I can feel you, Miriam," he murmured. "There is no need to run. I've come to bring you home." His voice was warm, inviting, a voice that had deceived thousands. Miriam's breath quickened. "We have to go," she whispered, gripping her son's hand. "The train should have arrived by now." But the tracks were empty. Elijah glanced at his watch. The scheduled train wasn't coming. "Did you really think I'd let you leave?" Nathaniel's voice carried across the station. He stepped forward slowly, confidently. "Come now, Miriam. We both know you were never meant to escape me." Miriam's son clutched her tightly. "Mama," he whispered. "He's lying." Miriam steeled herself. She would not let him take her child. "I won't go with you," she said firmly. Nathaniel's smile didn't falter. "I'm not asking." He lifted a hand, and the wind shifted. The very air seemed to bend to his will. Elijah felt the pressure in the air change. His breath caught. It was like standing at the eye of a storm. Miriam's son stared at Nathaniel. His young face was calm. Too calm. And then he spoke. "You don't control me," the boy said, his voice steady. "You never did." Nathaniel's smile faltered. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. "You don't know what you are, child," he said, voice softer now. But the boy shook his head. "I know enough." The ground shuddered. The shadows that always followed Nathaniel suddenly recoiled as if in fear. The prophet took a step back. That was when Elijah realized the boy wasn't afraid. He wasn't running. He was standing his ground. Nathaniel's fingers twitched. This wasn't right. The boy should be afraid. But he wasn't. Instead, the child's gaze bore into him, unyielding. The watchers, the shadows that had always served him, suddenly hesitated, as if waiting for something. Miriam felt the shift too. For years she had run from Nathaniel, believing him to be unstoppable, but now, for the first time, he was unsure. Her grip on her son's hand tightened. "You can't have him," she said, her voice steady. Nathaniel's jaw clenched. "You don't understand, Miriam. He belongs to me." The boy took a step forward. Nathaniel flinched. Elijah saw it. Miriam saw it. And that was when they knew he was afraid. The boy tilted his head. "You don't like it, do you?" he said, his voice quiet but cutting. "You can feel it." Nathaniel took a deep breath, forcing his confidence back. "This is not a game, child." But the boy only smiled, a knowing, ancient smile. "No," he said, "but I am not afraid of you anymore." Nathaniel's hands clenched. The shadows behind him pulled away. Elijah felt something crack in the air. It wasn't physical, it was power. Nathaniel's grip on whatever dark forces he commanded was weakening. Miriam took another step forward, realizing it too. "This is over," she whispered. Nathaniel's face twisted with something unfamiliar. Desperation. Nathaniel turned sharply to Deacon Abel. "Now!" he snapped. Abel hesitated. For the first time ever, he hesitated. "Papa?" Nathaniel's patience snapped. "Do it!" But Abel's face was pale. They aren't listening." The moment shattered. The watchers turned away from Nathaniel. The power that had bound them to him for years was broken. He gasped, clutching his chest as if something had been ripped from him. His body trembled. "No." Nathaniel fell to his knees. The force that had made him untouchable was gone. His fingers dug into the ground as he gasped for breath. This is not possible," he whispered, but the boy simply looked down at him, pity in his young eyes. "You built your power on fear," he said softly, "and now there is nothing left." Nathaniel shook. The prophet, the man who had controlled so many, the man who had commanded the darkness itself, and yet as the sun rose over the horizon, he was nothing. Miriam let out a shaky breath. It was over. Elijah took a slow step forward. "What happens to him now?" he asked. Miriam exhaled. "Nothing." Nathaniel lifted his head, tears in his eyes. He had lost. The darkness he had worshipped had abandoned him. He was alone. The train finally arrived. Miriam turned to Elijah. "You should go." Elijah hesitated. "And what about you?" She smiled softly. "We'll be okay now." Elijah looked at the boy, so small yet so powerful. "Are you sure?" Miriam nodded. For the first time in years, yes. Nathaniel remained on the ground, silent. The watchers were gone. His followers had scattered. Miriam stepped onto the train, her son's hand in hers. As the doors closed behind them, she didn't look back. Days later, news spread. Prophet Nathaniel had vanished, his church dissolved, his followers denied ever knowing him, his name was never spoken again, and far away in a quiet town, a mother and her child lived in peace. And as for Elijah, he never wrote the story. Some things, he realized, were meant to be left buried.